Hello and welcome to Web Programming 2, ASP.NET 5. If you just finished watching the last video, it was kind of setting the groundwork for going hands-on, where I was giving you kind of the overview, the 30,000 foot flyby, so to speak, of the ASP.NET 5 layout and how it differs from ASP.NET 4 and previous versions of ASP.NET. In this video, what I want to do is I want to go through the basics of setting up a project and showing how out of the box how the basic things work, and then adding some dependencies and middleware and things. Now, this is going to be laying the groundwork, so we're just going to do some of the basics because I want you, we're not going to be building something super robust right out of the gate. I want you to understand how things connect and how things relate to one another within the project and web development environment. So first thing I want you to do is go ahead and open up Visual Studio if you don't have it already open. If you need to pause the video to get it open, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, follow along, just click File, New, and New Project. Now when you first open up a new project here, you have all sorts of choices that you can deal with. You can have installed or online or what have you on the left hand side. Now when you first come in here, depending on what you chose last time, if you've already messed with Visual Studio, you're gonna have different choices selected. What I want you to do is click on Web, and then you should see here's your choices here. You want ASP.NET Web Application. Now down here, what I'm going to do is we're just going to do, I'm going to call mine ASP.NET Blog. Actually, I'm going to call it NTC ASP.NET Blog. And so give it a name. And so give it, we're not going to actually do blogging but at this point, but that's pretty common today on the web. So I'm going to put that down. And then underneath that, the location of where you want your files stored. You can put your files anywhere you want. Like I mentioned in the previous video, you can have with ASP.NET 5, you don't have to store it on IIS. You can run it in virtually any environment, package it up. But for right now, I'm just going to put, I have IIS running right here on my C drive. I'm just going to put it there because that's where I put a lot of my web files, but I could run it anywhere. And then what is your solution going to be named? So, and I'm going to have it go ahead and create the directory for my solution because I do not have a directory entitled NTC ASP.NET Blog. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, we're not going to, it's out of the scope of this course to talk about it, but if you went through collaborative application development, then you probably discussed source control like Git, and you could use Git to add this to source control, or there's source control built into Visual Studio, some basic Visual Studio source control as well. So I'm not going to do that here, but just so you know it's there. Also, just before I click OK here, up here I have, I need to re-enter my credentials, but at some point during the semester we're going to work with Azure, and I'm going to show you how to deploy to an Azure cloud environment. We're not going to do that right now, so I'm not going to worry about it, but you can actually do it rather seamlessly right from Visual Studio by entering your credentials, having an account set up with Azure, and you can do that. I'm going to set you up, actually you're going to set yourself up with some credentials for me to actually use Azure at a future date. So just so you know what this is meaning over here on the right. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and then I have what type of template do I want. Now we still have ASP.NET 4 templates, and again I'm going to talk about ASP.NET 4 in a future video, but I want to concentrate on the newer stuff, ASP.NET 5. Now I want to explain what these three choices are down here. This web application, that is a full-fledged web application. So that template's a fully functional ASP.NET 5 web application. It's complete with data access, membership services, all pre-configured and ready to go. So that's a pretty good one to start with when you're starting to choose your own projects, because even if you don't need everything, it gives you, when you start out, you can choose to take advantage of the things you do need and then just delete what you don't use. Now, I'm not going to be using that template because by the end of the videos I'm going to do, we're going to actually manually build some of that, because I'm going to show you how to do that, and I want you to understand how everything works. We're going to actually build everything that's contained in this template and more. So the only difference is that we'll have created it ourselves from the ground up. But it's a good time saver in the future. The next one is Web API. Web API template is for creating, well, web APIs, which you may have heard the term RESTful APIs or AJAX services. Basically, that's applications that are data service applications who their only purpose is to provide data to clients. So they don't render any type of HTML or JavaScript or CSS, other than they may kick out JSON or something like that. Now, we're not going to be doing this initially. I am going to teach you how to write RESTful web services, and you are going to do that, but initially we're not going to do that. So you're not going to be missing anything by choosing what I'm going to have you choose. So, but if you want to, feel free to play with those, you can. So I'm going to click on empty. So empty template, it's a bare bones template. Has a very basic files. I think that's a good one to start off with because you don't have it all convoluted with everything that's contained in the web application, and we can start to see how things are pieced together before we dump everything into it. So it's a good layout just to get us started building our application. It generates very little for us and leaves the rest up to us to implement everything by hand. So again, I'm going to choose just the empty one. Now before I choose that and click OK, what I wanted to also talk about, and even though I mentioned it in a previous little section about Microsoft Azure, again, we're going to go into that in later sections. Right now, I'm going to uncheck that box because I'm not going to host in the cloud at this point. Right now, I just want to go through, like I said before, the basics of how ASP.NET version 5 works and the little pieces that to get us going. So I'm going to uncheck that box for right now. And you click OK, and it generates the box. Let me open up Solution Explorer here and pin it. Let me just bring that down because I want to see more of the project. And it brings up this Welcome to ASP.NET 5. Now, I would encourage you at some point to take a look at a lot of these how-tos and videos and things like that they have there. A lot of this stuff I am going to go through, like middleware and, you know, adding controllers and views and all that sort of thing, but I would encourage you, it's a good resource to go through. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and close that down. So as you can see, it's going to create this startup.css, which is the very first bare bones file to start up your application. So currently, this is the only code running on our site. We don't have any dependencies or anything else like that. So if you look, it has this little piece of code right here, which basically says, okay, when you start up, when our application runs, I want you to spit out the text right to their hello world. So in order to do this, I like to use keyboard shortcuts. A keyboard shortcut to start up and fire up your web server, it uses IIS Express to actually run, is Control F5. So I'm going to hit Control F5, and you can see it's starting to build there. And let me bring it over to the screen so you can see it. And see, it says Hello World right there. Now I want to show you something. Let me move that back off the screen here. If we go and I change to Hello Students and I hit Save, I did not rebuild. I just hit Save. Now if I bring it back and just click Refresh, see, it says Hello Students. So that's one of the features of ASP.NET 5 is you don't, I mentioned it in the previous video, you don't have to recompile. It's smart enough to know what part of the code to update when you do a refresh and things like that. So you've, if you followed along with me, you've built your very first ASP.NET 5 web application. Now again, doesn't do very much at this point, but we've at least got a bare bones thing to start with. So now what I want to do is let's move on and let's take a look at how with creating this using the empty project template, and now you know how to execute code and stuff. I want to explore what else can we do with this startup class and move past this simple, straightforward, hard-coded because Hello Students response, because in most things you're going to do, it's not going to be hard-coded. So we're going to handle web requests in a little bit more meaningful way. But I want to just, before we dive into that, I want to take a little bit to explain a concept that is a major change and at the basics of ASP.NET 5, and that's what's called middleware. Now, what you're going to notice as we go along is I'm going to make some references throughout this course prior to even getting to Node I'm going to make references to Node and the way some of the JavaScript world, open source Node world works. Here's why. With the explosion of how Node has become successful and so popular, and how some of that open source stuff works, Microsoft saw the writing on the wall, and what they basically did, particularly with ASP.NET 5, you see some of this in ASP.NET 4, but really a lot in ASP.NET 5, is they saw and they said, okay, here's the way that the open source community is working with all of these web developers and things like that. If ASP.NET is going to remain competitive, we got to kind of play the game. So what they've done is they've kind of encompassed some of the things from that open source world, from the Node world and things like that. So we're going to work with a little bit of that. Middleware is one of those concepts that the open source web development world came ahead with. So the concept of middleware, it's just like it sounds. Basically, a web application is nothing more than a bunch of functions that get registered to handle requests in a certain order. So when a request comes into ASP.NET, it's asked to service, then ASP.NET simply creates a new instance of a pipeline and populates it with the necessary functions from the middleware, and then it calls them one after another so that each one has an opportunity to modify the request or perform some kind of action before the response is sent back to the user. So we can inject this middleware in that pipeline request, so we can have different requests sequentially happen one right after another. Now, the interesting thing about this process is that none of these functions know anything about each other. All they do is just execute their logic, so it's very modular in nature. But if you follow this approach, it leads to creating middleware functions that are generic enough that they may be reused in a whole bunch of different applications. So you're going to reuse a lot of them over and over again. In fact, pretty much all of ASP.NET 5 that I'm going to show you is implemented as middleware. It's just functions you plug in and put it in the right order. And so you'll be seeing me do a lot of that. Now, one thing to note, and I'll probably say this more than once, is that the order that you put your middleware in is important, because it gets executed in the order with which you have it in your code. It's very top-down linear. That it comes from the JavaScript world. So it's a vertical linear progression. So make sure you put them in the order you want them to do it. So now if we take a look again at our program that's running, and we browse, and we have this app.run, I want to show you what happens if I browse to different areas. So what if I do, a test, it's not a folder that exists, and I just run it. It returns hello students. What if I do another one, NTC? It returns hello students. So every single request that we're making to our website is responding with the same hard-coded text. I know, not really flashy, but it's happening because our default application has one single piece of middleware registered, and that middleware that's registered is simply our app.run that you see on your screen. That's the middleware, app.run method. Because it's the only functionality registered, and it has no conditional logic to keep it from executing, it's the only thing that gets executed on every single request. The app.run method is actually a special way of registering logic. That's the final piece of logic to execute for every request. So in other words, it basically says, okay, I want you to execute this logic and then immediately return the response to the user. So for example, let me show you how I can prove this. I'm going to make a copy of that code, and I'm going to change the second one. Now if I bring my code back in and I click refresh, notice it says hello students. Let me get rid of into that URL and go back to my root one there. It says hello students. We don't even see hello world. So the second one is completely ignored. If we were to switch the two around, we'd see hello world and we wouldn't see hello students. So the first one gets rendered, the second one gets ignored. So it shows you how the registering logic with app.run, that ends the request. So make sure you don't have middleware after that you want to run. But it also, I think this also reinforces an important point behind using middleware. And that middleware, again, gets executed in the order in which you register it. So you want to watch out for this behavior, because if you misplace middleware when it gets registered, you can have a tough time in trying to figure out, hey, why isn't my code running the way I want it to run? So just be aware of that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to modify this. We're going to modify app.run, and we're going to change it to app.use. Okay, now app.use is runs the code, but it doesn't stop the request. So we're going to use that so that both functions will execute and both messages will get rendered to the user. Now, to make this work, we'll need to add a second parameter to it called next. So when we go in our method, we got to add a next parameter there. So what will happen here is app.use will run, and it'll write hello students to the page, but then I have this next parameter that's here in my async method. What I have to do is I have to tell it to actually run that next method, which simply tells ASP.NET, hey, go ahead and, well, run the next method, which will be our ASP or app.run in our ASP.NET application. So now if I save that, bring it back over, now I see hello students and hello world there in my application. So it's a way we can have it run sequentially through our application to get the logic to run that we want to run it. So don't forget that next method to call that after you get your logic to run. So now, what if we only want to run logic under certain conditions? So we have logic in our file here, but we have certain conditional logic like if statements or whatever we can use to have it only run under certain parameters. So for example, what if I only want to run this logic if the URL starts with a certain path? So all we have to do is we have to wrap our use statement, wrap it in with an if statement with some conditional logic around the write async method, and that checks for, in this case, in my example, the URL pattern. And if the URL matches, the content gets rendered out. Otherwise, the request isn't modified, and processing just continues on the next function that is registered to handle it. So let's take a look at how. So what I'm going to do is here inside my first use, I'm going to put in an if, and I'm going to move my wait context in it. So this wait context response async method, hello students, will only render if our if condition returns true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say context dot request dot path dot starts with segments, and I'm simply going to tell it, we'll do hello. So if I save it and I go back here and I refresh, I see just hello world. But if I go to my URL and I go to hello, now I see hello students and I see hello world. So I just wanted to introduce you to a little bit of the conditional control flow logic that is available to you within ASP.NET 5. So now that I just introduced you to the basic concept of middleware, but this little middleware that you see, that's just about all you can do with the core ASP.NET APIs that you get out of the box. But unlike previous versions of the ASP.NET framework, in the previous versions, the entire ASP.NET framework was installed on a machine and automatically available to you. In ASP.NET 5, you have to explicitly opt in to any libraries that you want to be using. So you don't have any libraries there if you don't ask for them. So I want to show you how to link not only to any missing ASP.NET libraries that you want, but also to those, there's thousands upon thousands of other third-party community supplied libraries that you can use to help build your application. So in order to do that, we have to become familiar with a file that was created for us when we created our project, and that is this project.json file. Let me make that a little bigger so it's a little easier to see. So this is one of the things, when we get to the node world, you're going to see this. Project.json, this is one of the things Microsoft kind of co-opted from the open source community. So this project.json file, it contains a lot of information for us when we created our project. Contains, describing Visual Studio and the .NET build system and everything you need to know about your project. What version it is, what Microsoft ASP.NET, and here we're using release candidate 1 for ASP.NET 5, things like that. Though what we're concerned with though is this dependency section right here, and what dependencies it's using. Right now we're just depending on the core ASP.NET library. So in this case, this dependency section, like I said, it's saying, okay, we're using ASP.NET 5 release 1.0 release candidate 1 final. Okay, so the name part in these libraries, it's this section, that's dependency section, it's in JSON format, and it lists all the libraries that our application depends on and their reference as a list of name value pairs as any JSON object would. So the name part of the entry indicates the name of the library that our application depends on, and the value part of the entry indicates the version number of our library. So in this instance, the Microsoft.ASP.NET.Server.IIS library that was automatically listed for us contains 1.0.0-RC1-final. Okay, so the version. So that allows us to execute our application within the IIS Express web server. So without this library, we'd be seeing nothing but errors in our browser when we'd attempt to run an application, since IIS. We have no idea what to do with it. So with this format, it's pretty easy to add a new dependency when we need one. So let's say we want to respond to a request with static HTML files. That functionality is implemented as a middleware library, and then we can add right from this file. So let's try adding a new line, and we'll see what happens here when we do this, because Visual Studio really helps us out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to dependencies, let's put a comma there, and I'm going to start typing, and notice once I put in quotes, Visual Studio did the drop down help for me. So I just start typing the word static, and I want static files. This is what I want. So as I'm typing, I'm just what's happening is ASP.NET 5 Visual Studio with the Smart Code dropdown is going out and searching through all these libraries out there to find the ones I want. I want the Microsoft.ASP.NET.static file. So I've found it. I hit enter, and it's going to jump me over to the value. And which one do I want? I want the one that corresponds, so 1.0.0 release candidate 1 final. So I hit enter, and there it is. Now, what I want you to notice before I hit save is my references here and what I have. Now I'm going to close that, and I'm going to open it back up, and I want to open my output here so we can see this when I go to save it. So see my output, it went through and added those dependencies to my file. Now, the references I should say. Now when I open references, I now have this Microsoft ASP.NET.static file. So it added it for me, and it added everything it needed for me to do static files. So now now that we have it, now I want to look at how do I actually serve up those static files. So in the lab files, you're going to be given, you should see there's a zip file, and there is going to be an HTML and a CSS file there. So it's just a simple web page, just an HTML file and CSS file with a little bit of styling. So in order to host those, all I have to do is I have to grab those files. Let me grab them here. So these are the files you're going to see. There's a CSS file, it's entitled blog, and an index file. And what I have to do is I have to have those here in my webroot folder right over here. So what I can do is I can take these, highlight them, but let me right click here on webroot, and I'm going to open folder in File Explorer so I can see it right there, and then I'm going to copy those and paste those right there, and then just close it. So now I have my blog.css and index.html file in my www root. So this www root folder, it's kind of a safeguard. In previous versions of ASP.NET, you had to put all of your application code and static files all into one application folder. ASP.NET 5 actually encourages you to separate these two types of files. And so as I go through some of these, we'll continue to put all of our application code and development artifacts into the root of our project, just like before. But any static files that we want to expose to the world, we'll place in this www root folder, and ASP.NET will expose them for us. Now, if I go and I try to refresh my browser here and try to serve up those static files, and let me get rid of my hello that I had there. See, I have my hello world. So it didn't actually serve them up. So it actually responded with the canned responses that I've been playing with here. So since we've already gone through the concept of middleware, we could just go ahead and get rid of those responses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here to my startup. So I'm going to go to my configure here, and I'm just going to take and highlight those and just delete them. And just get rid of them. Okay, so now that we have that set up, if I do a Control F5, I now see the static file that I have set up to run. However, there is a small but subtle issue here. It's actually not serving up this file through ASP.NET. It's actually serving it up through IIS Express. So what's happening here is that because I don't have any, if I move this over, I don't have any requests in here or anything for my app. What's happening is it's the IIS Express is saying, okay, you need to run, but you don't have anything here, but I'll serve it up for you. We don't want that. We want our ASP.NET application to do it for us. So the way we've got to do that, if we go back to our project JSON file, right here, this piece right here is how we have it run the instead of IIS Express doing it, we would have ASP.NET, which is just running on IIS Express, doing it for us, so we can control that. So we need to make a small little change in our application so that it does that, so IIS Express is not running. So to change the hosting runtime to use this web server within ASP.NET as opposed to the IIS Express, what we can do is we can right click here on our project here, open up properties, and if it'll start off on application right here, but if we want to go to debug, see how it's saying IIS Express? What we can do is we can change that to web, and that's now set to our web hosting environment. And let me do a save all. And then if I come back here and I go to localhost like 5000 here, okay, it says not available. And I know you're thinking, well, it's not available, why are you doing that? Well, that's a good thing, because what it's doing is IIS Express is not taking over. It's allowing our ASP.NET to render it, and it's not doing it for us, which is what we don't want. And if we go back to our startup, there's nothing there to render, so it's not rendering it for us. So in order to do that, we have to tell our ASP.NET application to actually serve up these files like IIS would. So what we have to do is we have to basically tell it to emulate. So we've told it to switch from using the built-in IIS Express server and modify the properties, and to use our web command so that it can emulate the IIS server. So the ASP.NET is actually serving it up. So it's running this web listener that's defined by our web command within this project JSON file right there. Okay. So what we can do is we can tell it now back in our startup.css, instead of having IIS jump into our pipeline and take over, we can tell it whatever we register in the ASP.NET pipeline we want it to actually run. But we don't have any middleware registered in our ASP.NET pipeline. So we haven't registered anything because we removed all those commands. So we can fix this pretty easily, especially since we've added the static library already. So what we'll do in the startup class is we have to add a line here for our app dot use file server. So basically we're saying, okay, we have this static library within our ASP.NET, so instead of the web server taking over, our app is actually controlling it. So now what I can do is I can start that. Let me close my browser, and I'm going to start this back up, bring it back over, and now it's serving. I know it looks the same as before, but the big difference is under the covers. My static HTML page and CSS are showing up, but it's the middleware from our ASP.NET application that's imitating the basic file serving logic that IIS has. So this time when we run our site, we see our full page just like we did before with IIS, but now we can run our ASP.NET's application anywhere. So you think, okay, big deal. Here's the big deal. Before, without this is a big enhancement to ASP.NET 5. We have to run our ASP.NET application in an IIS Windows environment. By adding this logic, I can take this application, I can plunk it onto an Apache server or what have you, and it'll still run as it ran on an IIS Windows-based application. So that's that modularization I was mentioning before, where we're allowing our application to emulate file server logic so we can make our application portable across any platform we want.